Yorkshire, 1944. The mess hall door swung open on a November evening, cold air rushing in behind 30 German prisoners who filed through with the shuffling exhaustion of men who'd spent 8 hours digging drainage ditches in freezing rain. Inside, the warmth hit them like a physical presence, steam rising from serving trays, the smell of cooking food so rich and unexpected it made them stop mid-step. They had been told what to expect from British prison food. Starvation rations, barely enough to survive. Watery gruel designed to keep them weak and compliant. Punishment disguised as sustenance. What they smelled instead, what they would taste in the next few minutes, would shatter every belief they held about British cruelty, about wartime scarcity, about what enemies do to those they've captured. The journey had begun 3 months earlier on a grey morning outside Caen. Friedrich Bauer stood among 200 men in a makeshift holding facility, his Wehrmacht infantry uniform torn and stained with the mud of Normandy hedgerows where his unit had fought until ammunition ran out and surrender became the only option. He was 27, a baker's son from Bavaria, who'd been drafted in 1941 and had somehow survived 3 years of war that killed most of his company. Around him, paratroopers who'd been cut off during the invasion's first days, tank crews whose Tigers had been knocked out by Allied air power, even some Luftwaffe personnel whose airfield had been overrun so quickly they'd barely had time to burn their codebooks. They had expected execution. The propaganda had been explicit and constant. The British were barbarians who respected no conventions, who had invented the concentration camp to terrorize the Boers and would gladly revive such methods for Germans. Churchill himself, they'd been told, had ordered that no mercy be shown to soldiers of the Reich. Better to die fighting than fall into British hands where torture and starvation waited. Instead, they received British army blankets, medical treatment for wounds that would have been left to fester, and rough uniforms stamped with POW across the back in black paint. The letters felt like a brand, marking them as property of His Majesty's government, stripping away the identity they'd fought to maintain, even in defeat. The ship crossing to England was torment enough without violence. Darkness below decks, the constant roll of Channel waters. Men packed so tightly that breathing required effort. They clutched photographs of wives, children, parents they believed they'd never see again. Friedrich kept a small piece of paper hidden in his boot, a recipe his mother had written for him before he left Bavaria. Sauerbraten, the way she made it, with ingredients that seemed like fantasy now. He'd kept it through Russia, through France, through the collapse of everything certain. The English Channel was grey and rough even in August, waves sending spray over the bow that found its way through every gap in the ship's superstructure. Men who'd survived artillery barrages and tank attacks got seasick, retching into buckets, reduced to misery by simple motion. When the ship's engines changed pitch and they knew land was approaching, fear replaced seasickness. Whatever the British had planned, they would face it soon. England appeared through mist like something from another world. Green countryside, intact villages, no bomb craters, no burned buildings, just landscape that looked untouched by war. The prisoners stared in confusion. Where was the devastation the Luftwaffe had caused? Where were the starving masses, the ruined cities, the broken infrastructure? German newsreels had shown London burning, had claimed British industry was destroyed, had insisted the island was on the verge of collapse. But this countryside looked prosperous, functional, alive in ways Germany itself no longer was. The camp emerged from Yorkshire moors like a frontier outpost, wooden barracks arranged in neat rows, surrounded by wire fence that looked substantial but not vicious. Guard towers at intervals, sentries who read newspapers and drank tea rather than watching prisoners with predatory intensity. The camp commandant was a British Army colonel named George Whitmore, a man in his late 50s who'd served in the Great War and carried himself with the tired authority of someone who'd seen enough suffering to last 3 lifetimes. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," he said through a translator, a German-speaking lance corporal who rendered his words with precision. You will work on assigned labour. You will be fed British military rations. You will be housed according to international law, and you will be treated humanely. Any guard who violates this policy will be court-martialed and imprisoned. The German prisoners stood in formation, Yorkshire wind cutting through their thin uniforms. Trying to process these words, humanely, fed military rations, housed according to law. It had to be performance, some elaborate British deception before the real treatment began. Colonel Whitmore dismissed them to their barracks. The buildings were utilitarian but solid. Iron beds with thin mattresses, small stoves that actually provided heat, windows that could be opened for ventilation. Not comfortable, but not the disease-ridden hellholes they'd expected. In the corner of each barracks, a radio played BBC broadcasts. British voices reporting the war with measured honesty, acknowledging setbacks, reporting advances without triumphalism, as if facts mattered more than morale. Psychological warfare, an older prisoner named Feldwebel Richter muttered. He'd been a party member, his brother an SS officer. They make you comfortable, make you soft, then the real punishment begins. Friedrich wanted to believe him. It would make sense of things. But as days passed, the punishment never came. Morning came with reveille at 6:00 a.m. Roll call in the compound yard. Yorkshire mist making everything grey and damp and cold in ways that felt permanent. British guards counted the prisoners with bureaucratic efficiency, checked names against lists, then directed them to the mess hall for breakfast. Friedrich had been preparing himself for this moment since capture. He knew what prison food would be. He'd heard stories from his father, who'd been a POW in France during the last war. Watery soup with occasional vegetable scraps. Bread that was mostly sawdust. Perhaps some ersatz coffee made from burned grain. Rations calculated to keep prisoners barely alive, barely functional, perpetually hungry. The first morning, filing into the mess hall, the smell hit him before he saw the food. It wasn't the smell of rot or mould or desperation. It was the smell of actual cooking, real food, being prepared by people who knew what they were doing. Friedrich's stomach, which had been in a permanent state of cramping hunger for months, suddenly woke up with painful intensity. The serving line was organised, efficient. British cooks behind steam tables, guards supervising, prisoners moving through with tin plates and cups. And the food. God, the food. Porridge with milk. Real milk, not the thin ersatz that had been common in Germany for 2 years. Bread, actual wheat bread that was soft and fresh. A piece of bacon, small but real, the fat glistening. Tea with sugar. Friedrich stared at his plate as if it were a hallucination. Around him, men were having the same reaction. Some stood frozen, afraid to touch the food. One man, an older soldier from Hamburg, started crying silently. Tears cutting lines through the dirt still on his face from yesterday's work detail. A British guard serving behind the line, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and weathered hands, noticed their shock. He spoke no German, but his gesture was universal. He picked up a spoon, mimed eating, smiled encouragingly, moved to the next man. Permission granted. The men ate slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as their bodies remembered what real food was. Friedrich took a bite of the porridge and felt something break inside him. It was thick, properly cooked, sweetened with real sugar. The bacon was salty and rich, fat and protein his body had been craving for months. The bread was soft and warm and tasted like civilization, like a world before war made everything scarce and desperate. Some men became sick, their stomachs unable to handle richness after months of near starvation. Others simply cried as they ate, overwhelmed by the gap between what they'd expected and what they'd received. In Germany, civilians were eating tulip bulbs, grass, anything to fill the grinding hunger. German soldiers at the front got by on black bread and thin soup. Here, prisoners of war were eating better than German civilians, better than German soldiers, perhaps better than some German officers. The transformation wasn't immediate, it took time. But that first meal began something that would eventually become complete. The work assignments came after breakfast. Some men were sent to local farms, others to road repair, still others to camp maintenance. The labour was real, but not crushing. 8-hour shifts with breaks, water and tea provided throughout the day, supervisors who corrected mistakes without violence, who treated prisoners as workers rather than slaves. Friedrich was assigned to the camp kitchen detail. This was both irony and gift. He'd been a baker before the war, knew his way around food preparation. The British cook in charge, a sergeant named Thomas Mulligan, was an Irishman from Cork who'd worked in hotels before enlisting. He ran his kitchen with professional standards, expecting cleanliness, efficiency, proper technique. Through gestures, broken phrases, and the universal language of cooking, Mulligan taught Friedrich and 2 other Germans the British way of making stew. This was where Friedrich's understanding of the world began to truly crack. He'd expected prison kitchens to serve the minimum required. Instead, Mulligan showed them how to make proper stock from bones and vegetables, how to brown meat to develop flavour, how to layer ingredients so everything cooked properly, how to season with more than just salt. Food matters, Mulligan said, through a translator who'd been called to the kitchen to help with communication. Doesn't matter if they're prisoners, doesn't matter if they're Germans, they're human beings doing work for His Majesty's government. They eat proper food. This statement was incomprehensible according to everything Friedrich had been taught. Germans were the master race, supposedly superior to all others. Yet here was an Irish cook treating German prisoners with more humanity than Friedrich had seen German officers show to their own men. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. The weeks accumulated into months. September became October. Yorkshire weather turning cold and wet in ways that soaked through everything. But the food remained consistent. Porridge for breakfast, sandwiches with real butter for lunch, and dinner. Dinner became the focus of each day, the meal that every prisoner thought about during work details. Mulligan rotated through different dishes. Monday was shepherd's pie, layers of meat and vegetables topped with mashed potatoes that had real butter and milk. Tuesday was fish, usually cod or haddock, battered and fried properly. Wednesday was roast chicken with vegetables. Thursday was sausages with mashed potatoes and gravy. Friday was fish again, in deference to Catholic prisoners. Saturday was mixed grill. And Sunday was the meal that broke the last of Friedrich's certainty about British cruelty. Sunday dinner was beef stew. Not the watery soup he'd expected from prison food, but actual stew, thick and rich, made the way Mulligan had taught them. Chunks of beef that had been properly browned. Potatoes, carrots, onions, turnips, all cooked until tender, but not mushy. Stock that had been simmered for hours to extract every bit of flavour. Seasoned with herbs from the kitchen garden, thickened properly, served hot with fresh bread for soaking up the gravy. The first Sunday this appeared, the mess hall went silent. Men stared at their plates in disbelief. This wasn't survival food. This wasn't punishment disguised as sustenance. This was real cooking, the kind of meal you'd serve to family, to people you cared about. One of the younger prisoners, a boy from Frankfurt, who couldn't have been more than 19, took one bite and started sobbing. "Meine Mutter," he whispered. My mother. The stew tasted like home, like peace, like a world where people cared about making food with love. Friedrich ate his portions slowly, analysing every element with his baker's palate. The meat had been properly seared before stewing, creating those brown bits that added depth to the sauce. The vegetables had been added at different times, so everything cooked perfectly. The stock was real beef stock, not water with bouillon cubes. The seasoning was subtle but complete, nothing overpowering but everything present. This was professional cooking, made by someone who understood that food was more than just fuel. That evening, Friedrich sought out Sergeant Mulligan in the kitchen during cleanup. Through the translator, he asked the question that had been building in his mind for weeks. "Why do you feed us so well? You could give us minimum rations, keep us hungry and weak. Why don't you?" Mulligan looked at him with those weathered Irish eyes that had seen too much. "Because I'm a cook, not a torturer. My job is to feed people proper food. Doesn't matter if those people are friends or enemies. Food is how we prove we're civilized." This answer was too simple and too profound. Friedrich wrote about it that night in the small notebook he'd been allowed to keep. October 15th, 1944. The British feed us better than Germany feeds its own soldiers. They do this not because they have to, but because they believe it's right. I don't understand this. I was taught the British were weak, that their democracy made them soft, but feeding your enemies well when you could starve them, that's not weakness. That's something else, something I don't have words for yet. The letters from home, when they arrived through Red Cross channels, made the food issue more painful. Friedrich's wife wrote from Bavaria, describing conditions that made his prison camp seem like paradise. No meat for months, no butter, no sugar, no coffee, no chocolate. Bread rations cut again and again. Children crying from hunger. His mother eating soup made from potato peelings and grass. The letter ended, "You are blessed to be in England. At least there you eat." The psychological inversion was complete and crushing. Being a prisoner in England meant being fed better than being free in Germany. Friedrich was safer, healthier, better nourished than his own wife and mother. The guilt from this was almost unbearable. He worked harder on his kitchen detail, as if labour could atone for the sin of eating well while his family starved. It was during this time that Friedrich began to truly know Sergeant Mulligan. Not friendship exactly. Boundaries remained. But something like mutual respect between professionals who understood their craft. Mulligan had worked in Dublin hotels before the war, had cooked for wealthy patrons, had developed real skill. He'd enlisted in 1939, been assigned to catering corps, and now ran a prison camp kitchen with the same standards he'd maintained in civilian life. One evening in late October, during the quiet period after dinner service, Mulligan showed Friedrich something remarkable. A cookbook, old and worn, filled with handwritten recipes. "My grandmother's," Mulligan said through the translator, who'd become a regular presence in the kitchen. "She cooked for the big houses in Cork. Taught me everything about making food right." Friedrich understood. His own mother had taught him to bake, had passed down recipes that came from her mother's mother, back through generations. Food was memory, identity, connection to past and place. "Why do you show me this?" Friedrich asked. Mulligan shrugged. "Because you understand. Because you know that cooking's not just about feeding bodies. It's about feeding souls. It's about remembering we're human, even when everything else tries to make us forget." The transformation didn't happen all at once. It accumulated like the layers of flavour in Mulligan's stew, each day adding something, building toward a result that was more than the sum of its parts. The camp had other prisoners who'd worked in food service who understood cooking. They formed a strange community in the kitchen, Germans and British, working together to produce meals, united by the craft, even while their countries fought to destroy each other. One day in November, Mulligan made something special. It was a German dish, sauerbraten, made using techniques Friedrich had described. Mulligan had found a recipe in one of his books, had requisitioned the ingredients, had spent 3 days marinating the beef properly. When it was served, the German prisoners sat in stunned silence. Their enemy had made them food from their homeland, had taken the time and effort to learn their cuisine, had treated their culture with respect. Friedrich ate his portion with tears streaming down his face. It wasn't exactly like his mother's version. Mulligan had adapted it to British ingredients and techniques, but it was close enough to taste like memory, like home, like the world before everything went wrong. Around him, grown men were crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming confusion of being treated with this much humanity by people they'd been taught to hate. That night, Friedrich's notebook entry was longer than usual. November 8th, 1944. Today the British cook made a sauerbraten. He didn't have to. It wasn't required. He did it because he wanted to show us that our food, our culture, our memories matter. I was taught the British were barbaric, that democracy made them weak and cruel. But this cook treats us better than our own officers treated us. He feeds us well because he believes that's what civilized people do. What does this mean? Everything I was taught was a lie? December brought news that made the food situation even more pointed. Germany was collapsing. Allied armies closing from both sides, cities falling, supply lines cut, the Reich's infrastructure crumbling. Prisoners listened to BBC broadcasts that reported honestly, that acknowledged when Allies suffered setbacks, but made clear the overall trajectory. Germany was being destroyed. Letters from home painted pictures of horror. Friedrich's wife described the Christmas of 1944 as the worst of her life. No food, no heat, no hope. American bombers turning Munich to ash, Soviet armies pushing closer from the east, refugees flooding west with stories of atrocity. His mother had died in November, malnutrition and pneumonia, no medicine available, no strength left to fight. The letter ended. She spoke of you at the end, said you were blessed to be away from this hell. Christmas in the camp was subdued but remarkable. Colonel Whitmore approved extra rations, small gifts from Red Cross parcels, permission to sing carols. Mulligan outdid himself with the Christmas dinner. Roast goose, proper stuffing, roasted potatoes with goose fat, Brussels sprouts with bacon, gravy made from real drippings. For dessert, Christmas pudding with custard, made using pre-war recipes that required ingredients most civilians hadn't seen in years. The German prisoners ate in silence, overwhelmed by the gap between this meal and what their families were experiencing. Some couldn't finish, guilt overcoming hunger. Others ate everything, honoring the food, understanding that wasting it wouldn't help their families, but that appreciating it might honor something about maintaining humanity in inhumane times. After the meal, Friedrich approached Sergeant Mulligan in the kitchen. His English was better now, good enough for simple conversation. "I need to tell you something," he said carefully. Mulligan nodded, gestured to a stool. They sat in the quiet kitchen, steam still rising from cleaning water, the smell of Christmas dinner lingering. "Before the war, I believed what they taught us," Friedrich said slowly. "That Germans were superior, that other peoples were lesser, that the Führer's vision would create a better world, that showing mercy was weakness." He paused, finding harder words. "I believed these things easily because they made me feel important, part of something greater than myself." Mulligan listened without interrupting. "And I knew about the camps," Friedrich continued, his voice dropping to barely audible. "Not everything. But I knew Jews were being sent away. I didn't ask where. I told myself it wasn't my concern. I told myself many lies to avoid facing what my country was doing." The silence stretched between them, filled with the ticking of the kitchen clock, the distant sound of carols singing from the barracks. "I cannot undo what I believed. I cannot undo what I contributed to by my silence. But I want you to know that I see now. I see that your humanity was not weakness. I see that our supposed strength was actually cruelty. And I am more ashamed than I have words to express." Mulligan was quiet for a long time, his Irish face unreadable in the dim light. Finally he spoke. "Shame is easy. You feel bad, you cry, you think that's enough. But living differently is harder. Going home and choosing different when everyone else wants the old ways, that takes real courage." "Will you forgive me?" Friedrich asked. Mulligan shook his head. "That's not mine to give. The people who died in those camps, the ones who starved while you stayed silent, they're the ones you need forgiveness from. Most of them are gone now." "Then what do I do?" "You live differently. You go home and you feed people. You make good food, and you treat everyone with dignity. You teach your children that food is about more than just eating. It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone. You become the kind of person who would have spoken up, who would have helped, who would have chosen the harder path. He stood, began wiping down the counter. You asked why I feed you well. It's because I believe people can change. I believe Germany can learn. I believe there's still hope that this whole bloody mess can end with something better than more revenge and more hatred. Don't prove me wrong. January 1945 brought news that repatriation would begin in the spring. The war was clearly ending, Germany's defeat certain and imminent. The prisoners would be sent home to whatever remained. Major Whitmore called an assembly. All prisoners and guards together. The war is ending, he said through the translator. You will be sent home in the coming months. Until then, camp operations continue. He paused, looking out over the assembled men. I want to say something before you leave. When you return to Germany, people will ask about your time here. Some won't believe you. Some will say you're lying, that you've been brainwashed, but I need you to tell the truth anyway. The prisoners listened in absolute silence. Tell them that British soldiers guarded you and did not abuse you. Tell them that you were fed properly, treated according to law, respected as human beings even though you were enemies. Tell them that the ideology that brought you here was built on lies. Tell them that democracy's strength is not in cruelty, but in maintaining standards even toward those who would have shown you no mercy. His voice grew stronger. Your government committed atrocities. Millions murdered in camps. Millions more starved in occupied territories. That is what happens when a nation forgets that all humans deserve basic dignity. That is what happens when you believe some people matter more than others. The silence was absolute. We're sending you home to rebuild Germany. Don't rebuild the same nation. Build something better. Build something that recognizes strength in treating even enemies well. Build something that understands civilization is proven not by how you treat friends, but by how you treat those you have power over. Repatriation began in March. Groups of prisoners processed out, given papers, loaded onto lorries heading south to ports. Friedrich's group was scheduled for April. The last weeks in the camp felt suspended between worlds, between the certainty of war and the uncertainty of peace. On the final evening, Friedrich was in the kitchen, helping with dinner preparation one last time. Mulligan was teaching him a final recipe, beef Wellington, something complicated and beautiful that required real skill. You'll need this, Mulligan said in his Cork accent. When you get home, you'll need to remember that making beautiful food is an act of resistance against ugliness, that feeding people well is choosing civilization over barbarism. They worked in companionable silence, the way craftsmen do when words aren't necessary. When the dish was complete, Mulligan wrapped a piece of paper and handed it to Friedrich. It was a handwritten recipe, Mulligan's grandmother's Irish stew, with notes in English and German, adapted for German ingredients. For when you go home, Mulligan said simply. For when you need to remember. Friedrich couldn't speak. He just nodded, folded the paper carefully, put it in his pocket next to his mother's sauerbraten recipe. 2 pieces of paper, 2 recipes, 2 cultures connected by the universal language of cooking with care. The next morning, lorries came before dawn. Men loaded their few possessions, letters from home, notebooks filled with observations that would have been impossible to imagine 6 months before. They filed out through the camp gates, past the mess hall, where they'd learned what real food tasted like, past the kitchen where they'd learned that treating enemies with dignity was strength, not weakness. Colonel Whitmore stood at the gates, saluting as they passed. Sergeant Mulligan stood beside him, his cook's apron still on, his weathered face showing something like sadness. He raised his hand in a simple wave. Friedrich waved back, understanding that this Irish cook had taught him more about humanity than all the Nazi propaganda ever could. The ship back to Germany carried 350 prisoners from various camps. During the crossing, they shared stories. Some men from other camps spoke of harsh treatment, minimal food, guards who were cruel. They were bitter, unchanged, ready to resurrect old grievances. But the men from Friedrich's camp told different stories. Stories of being fed properly, of British cooks who treated food as sacred, of learning that civilization meant maintaining standards even toward enemies. Some didn't believe them, called them soft, brainwashed, traitors, but others listened, perhaps beginning their own reconsideration. Friedrich stood at the ship's rail as the German coast appeared, grey and cold under April rain. Beside him, the young soldier from Frankfurt who'd cried over the stew shivered in his thin coat. "Are you afraid?" the boy asked.
"Yes," Friedrich said, "but different than before. Before I was afraid of punishment. Now I'm afraid I won't be strong enough to live differently, that I'll go home and fall back into old ways because they're easier."
"Then we help each other," the boy said. "We remember together. We remember the stew." The ship docked at Cuxhaven, or what remained of it. The port was damaged, the city beyond it reduced to rubble, survivors moving like ghosts through ruins. Friedrich stepped onto German soil changed, transformed by captivity that had been more humane than his freedom had been. In the years after, Friedrich Bauer reopened his family's bakery in Bavaria. He baked bread, made pastries, created food with care and attention, and he cooked Mulligan's Irish stew, served it to anyone who was hungry, treated every customer with dignity, regardless of who they were. He taught his children that food was sacred, that how you treated people when serving them revealed your true character. Some neighbours complained, some called him British lover, traitor, but others ate his food and understood. And slowly, painfully, a generation began to learn different lessons than their parents had been taught. The young soldier from Frankfurt became a chef, trained properly, opened restaurants that became known for treating everyone with respect. He specialized in international cuisine, learning to make dishes from cultures his government had tried to destroy. Colonel George Whitmore continued serving until 1954. He never spoke publicly about his time commanding prison camps, but he kept letters from prisoners, letters describing their new lives, letters of thanks, letters proving that treating enemies well could change them. Sergeant Thomas Mulligan returned to Ireland after the war, opened a small restaurant in Cork, cooked until his hands couldn't hold a pan anymore. When asked why he'd treated German prisoners so well, he said simply, "Because I'm a cook. Cooks feed people. That's what we do." What happened in that camp and places like it across Britain was not widely known for decades. It didn't fit comfortable narratives, but it was real. German prisoners were fed properly, treated according to Geneva Convention standards, shown that democracy's strength lay not in cruelty, but in maintaining civilization even under pressure. And those encounters between men who'd been taught that the British were barbaric and cooks who proved that humanity mattered became a quiet part of transformation. Not dramatic, but real. The daily experience of eating food made with care by people you'd been taught to hate. The recognition that your enemies treated you better than your own leaders had. The prisoners who tasted British stew in 1944 expected punishment disguised as food. They found craftsmanship instead. They expected cruelty. They found care. They expected confirmation of propaganda. They found evidence that everything they'd believed was a lie. And in that gap between expectation and reality, something extraordinary happened. People changed their minds. People learned to see differently. People chose to build their lives on new foundations. That is the quiet victory that no army can achieve. That is the transformation that happens one person at a time, one meal at a time, one recognition at a time that the enemy is human too. In the end, it wasn't British military might that defeated Nazism in those men's hearts. It wasn't re-education programs or lectures. It was the simple experience of being fed well by people they'd been taught to despise. It was tasting stew made with care by a cook who believed all humans deserved proper food. It was learning that strength lay not in domination, but in maintaining civilization even toward enemies. That is the lesson that echoes across 80 years. That is the truth that survives when all the hatred is forgotten. That is the hope that remains when everything else has been destroyed. Humanity is proven not by how we treat friends, but by how we treat those we have power over. Civilization is maintained not through force, but through choosing dignity, even when cruelty would be easier. The men who left that camp in spring 1945 carried that lesson home, back to a destroyed nation that desperately needed to learn it. Some shared it through food, through restaurants and bakeries that treated everyone equally. Some lived it through teaching their children different values. Some passed it on through simple acts of feeding the hungry, whoever they were. And somewhere in that chain of transformation, in that quiet accumulation of changed minds and opened hearts, the world became slightly better than it was. Not perfect, not redeemed, but better. Built on the recognition that food is sacred, that cooking with care is an act of civilization, that treating even enemies with basic dignity is strength, not weakness. And sometimes, in the aftermath of total war, better is enough.